really a good writer, and he's suffering, of course.
Sister Helen,
Yeah.
can you tell us a little bit more about when you first noticed the disparities? You know, especially racial disparities in the judicial system.
Yeah. Millard Farmer was this crusty Georgian lawyer that I called in Atlanta when I realized this man I was visiting on death row. You got to understand, I know nothing about how the law works. I don't know about the appeals. I don't know about what ineffectiveness of counsel is, nothing. And when I saw that Patrick Saunier, his lawyer, was doing so badly before the Fifth Circuit, I didn't know Pat lost his life that day in that court. I called this lawyer, and he's the one who started educating me. And he'd drive in. He belonged to something called Team Defense in Atlanta. So poor, they never had money. They would go take these cases in the deep South. They'd get one motel room because they didn't have money. They would have people shoot at their rental car. People hated them because they'd taken these cases, and often it would be the case of an African-American man accused of killing a white person in a Georgia town. Not only did the man not have a chance, but the lawyers didn't have much of a chance. People hated them. I didn't know the thing of social opprobrium, to be a lawyer and identify yourself with people who are basically hated, or there's so much prejudice. And Millard is the first, he became our first teacher about the system. And we'd be driving to the prison, and he'd talk about ineffectiveness of counsel, and Pat Saunier was so poor, and that his lawyer did nothing for him. He did absolutely nothing for him. And then if you don't have a lawyer at your trial that makes a formal objection, it's not in the record, and when the appeals court get it, they just say you and your lawyer collaborated on that. So black people with an all-white jury, well, you and your lawyer collaborated on that. But then in the appeals you try to say, but my lawyer was bad. My lawyer let all the white jury be seated, even though my victim was a white woman in this little town. They say, no formal objection in court. It passes as you collaborated. And so that's how he showed me how race works in the system, how black people would get bumped from juries. Jefferson Parish in New Orleans is classic for that. It's a white bedroom community, and they had 6 ways to Sunday to get black people on jury. Just saying, you know, using spurious kind of things of it. And so I began to learn statistics. Just overwhelmingly, it's when white people are killed that the death penalty sought. And when people of color, and of course when I lived in the St. Thomas Housing Project, people were being killed all the time, and you were lucky if you could find 3 lines in the newspaper about the death of African American people. But let a white tourist come to the French Quarter and they're killed, their pictures in the paper, and there's big outrage. And it's a simple thing. It's not that people are bad or evil, and they get up in the morning and say we're going to do something racist. It's a simple thing of identification. When someone like us is killed, we identify them. When it's more a stranger, and the whole criminal justice system, 95% of prosecutors and judges are white. The system's white. And so then you have a person of color, especially if they killed a white person. I mean, you know, their number in the lottery shoots up to the top as a possibility of who. And yet on the flip side, white people who have killed people of color, both in the judicial system, but extrajudiciously with all the lynchings that are going on. That's why the 10 southern states that practice slavery do 80% of the executions. It comes out of a harsh penal system of whites who got afraid when slaves were freed to keep the criminal element in line. So we have the toughest prison system and death penalty system. So you can see it. And he taught me. And then I began to dig for it. When I wrote the book, I began to study and look at it and learned it. And then I had a really good editor at Random House, because I'd never written a book before. And he said, look, you're putting all your information in footnotes. Now, only scholars are going to read your footnotes. You got to weave that information into the stories, because people read for stories. So by the time they close the cover of that book,
They know how it's applied, how poverty makes a difference, how race makes a difference. Though the theory may be we're going to have it for the worst of the worst, when it comes down to actually decide now who is the worst of the worst and who can we kill, it boils down and you can read the profiles of it. So I learned a lot, still learning. I'm learning every day about how this thing works. But I've also learned the goodness of the American people. The American people are not bent on the death penalty. I bet, and you must know this, how much thought do people in New Hampshire give to the death penalty issue? I mean, it's just not one of those issues that touches people's lives personally. I mean, you're thinking about your children in school, you're thinking about getting the potholes filled or whatever. I mean, the school board meetings.
Food labels.
Huh?
Right now, this week it's food labels.
I mean, the real life, these are life things that go on. And who's really thinking about the death penalty? That's been my biggest surprise. That people just go, oh, I didn't know it was like that. So, and Thurgood Marshall was the first to say, you know, the first African American on the Supreme Court, the American people say they support the death penalty. Educate the American people, and they will reject the death penalty. And Pat Delahanty, this priest that works in Kentucky that's kept the death penalty way, way down, he just says to people all the time, the death penalty you support is not the one we have. Because people have a theory, oh, well, we need it for this. Theoretically, you want to hold on to these cases where, well, if somebody kills a child, if they kill a police officer, whatever. That's theory. But in practice, you have to look at the real human agents that make this or don't make it.
Thank you.
Don't y'all get this southern preacher none going. We need to mingle. We need to mingle and celebrate this great thing you did today.